as a graduate student at Columbia University, a white liberal female professor who made this argument that the US has been a democracy. And when I objected as a student that how could she say so, she actually became visibly agitated and responded by saying, "Can you give me any other country during this period that was more democratic?" I said, well, yes, all countries that did not enslave their people and commit genocide against Native Americans. Well, of course, I think the lobby is exceedingly important and the most powerful lobbying force in Washington, D.C. I do not believe it actually directs U.S. policy. Because, of course, what the argument seems to be saying is that absent the pro-Israel lobby and Israeli pressure, the U.S. would love Palestinians and Iranians. I believe the Netherlands, perhaps, is the most hateful anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian country in Europe, and not only recently, but since World War II.
That is, how can one explain the sort of general acceptance of genocide in Gaza outside of the framework of the racialization of Palestinians as non-white? That couldn't happen in any other way.
People like Tucker Carlson and others who market the lobby theory don't seem to understand is that this is an internal fight, an intra-bourgeois fight, if you will, between different segments of the American business class, and the fact that part of the business class that sees Israel as central to advancing American interests in the Middle East is the one that won over this fight and continues to win. Is what these people are blind to. The majority of those who have shifted, they have shifted to appreciate or support Palestinians as victims of genocide, which does not mean that they support the right of the Palestinians to resist genocide.
All right. Good day, everyone. We are here with another show with a very, very amazing panel. We are here with Professor Joseph Massad from Columbia University, and we are here, of course, with Dr. Ajamu Baraka. I noticed that not a lot of people often say that, but you are, of course, also a PhD like the rest of us, and I noticed that you seem to hide that a bit. We don't hear you say that very often. So I was like, today I'm going to say Dr. Ajamu Baraka. This is a very great panel because, as many of you know, Peter and I often focus on the social psychology behind the geopolitics that we see today. In my case, I focus a lot on how racism, capitalism, and colonialism still live on in our psychology today. Think about white supremacy, sexism, individualism. All these things I find very interesting. Peter is somebody who is very much focused on political ideologies and how these ideas get into our minds. And who better than to discuss these things with than Joseph and Ajamu. Now, I'm not going to do this typical boring introduction, so I'm going to ask both of you, and probably most of our audience will know you already, but maybe you can give us a bit of a short introduction who you are, so for those who don't know you, and maybe I can start with Joseph.
I'm a professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University, where I have taught for the last 27 years. I'm a graduate of Columbia University as well. I work on questions of nationalism, questions of racism, imperialism, settler colonialism, identity politics, cultural politics, interrelated, and I'm basically a specialist in the Middle East and the Arab world in the modern period, the 19th and the 20th century.
And
Thank you very much.
As a graduate of NYU, I just asked the audience not to hold Joseph's Columbia affiliation against him.
I shall not object to your caution.
Ajamu, I have muted you, Ajamu, because I'm muting people for background noise, just so everyone knows that. So you can unmute yourself.
Okay, well, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this very, very important conversation. It's good to be back with the both of you, and an honor to be with someone who I've always been following and really impressed with his analysis. And so glad that we have a chance to share a platform, Dr. Massad. Now, just a quick corrective, my friends. I hope this doesn't turn you off to me, but one of the reasons why I don't tout the PhD process is because I don't have a PhD. I was one of those terminal ABDs. When I went to grad school, and interestingly enough, I was supposed to go to Columbia, but I decided at the very last moment to forego that and to join the political science department at Atlanta University. And for people who may not know the history of Atlanta University, it was the school where Dr. Du Bois taught for many years and was the preeminent graduate school for African Americans. And the political science department at that time was known for being a radical hub of critical thought. And so everyone advised me to forego Columbia and the new school and to go to Atlanta. And that's what I did. Now, I went to get a master's, but they kept on giving me money. So I stayed into the PhD program. And, but some kind of way, because of that, in a few bios, they have me listed as a doctor. And I'm very conscious of that, giving the impression of perpetrating.
I read it and I was like, how come Ajamu has never said anything about it? But this makes it more clear. Okay.
Well, beyond that, I've been a lifelong political activist, a proud veteran of the Black liberation movement in the U.S. And currently, I am working with the Black Alliance for Peace, the North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. I'm also on the leadership body of a few organizations, the United National Anti-War Coalition, the U.S. Peace Council, and on the editorial board of the Black Agenda Report. So I combine, activist scholar work along with the movement building activity that I've been involved in for the last 54 years.
Ajamu and Joseph, we invited you because both of you often focus a lot on the racism behind the geopolitics that we see today. And I had Dr. Aaron Good on the show 2 days ago, and he said what we are witnessing is that the United States is becoming completely Nazified. He called it a Nazified society. What we're seeing right now, blatant genocide, talking about genetic inferiority of Iranians, etc., etc. Now, we also have very regularly, of course, Professor Gerald Horne on. Gerald Horne would say, I wouldn't call it Nazified. I think Gerald Horne would say it's just going back to the roots of the settler colonial society that the United States is. So my question is, and I'll start with you, Joseph, do you think that Palestine, and of course also Lebanon and Iran, and what is happening there is exposing the true face of the US empire and the West in general? And do you also see or feel that people are finally start to get it?
I'm not sure which people you're referring to, meaning people in the United States or outside.
Yeah, in particular the West in this case.
I see. No, I mean, I am not one of those people who thinks that the recent politics of the United States, especially with regard to Palestine or Lebanon or Iran, has exposed it any more than all its policies had done long before this, in terms of foreign policy since World War II, and in terms of domestic policy, and in the Western Hemisphere all the way back to the 19th century. So as far as I understand the United States, ever since I arrived as a young student to go to college, I have witnessed the country as committed to white supremacy, to white Christian supremacy, and I have seen those manifestations, of course, across the political spectrum, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and even sort of left Democrats and their publications. The commitment to imperialism, the commitment to a specific white Protestant imperialism. And we see some of this, perhaps the anti Catholic sentiment is being revived more recently, even though that had subsided, but perhaps by World War II. We see kind of a rejuvenation of anti Catholic rhetoric that goes back to the 19th century. The recent attacks on the relatively conservative new American Pope by Trump are illustrative of this kind of rejuvenated anti-Catholicism. But no, I mean, I really don't. I mean, however, I do think for liberals, for those who had delusions about the United States as a country that supports universalism, that fights racism, or anything of the sort, perhaps the last 3 years have exposed to them a part of the or a side of the United States with which they perhaps had not been familiar or they had not recognized. I think for those of us who know the history and present of American racism, its structural racism, the ideology and the hegemony of white supremacy, it has not been a surprise at all, as far as I'm concerned.
Before I go to you, Ajamu, you're also muted, by the way. I hear some background noise. Is that in your house, Joseph, or outside your house?
There's construction work outside on the street. I'm afraid.
Okay.
I shut down the window, but there's no escaping it, even though it's double glazed.
Okay.
It's just. I live on Amsterdam Avenue in New York, and they're doing construction.
Brings back memories.
I'm from the Netherlands, so that feels like home.
Yes, well,
Okay.
New York used to be called New Amsterdam, when the Dutch were the colonists, of course.
Oh yeah, our society is almost as terrible as the United States, I always say, or at least as bad, maybe even better.
No argument from my side.
Sorry, say that again, Joseph.
I said no argument from my side about how terrible the Netherlands has been historically and at present.
And I often try to highlight that, and people seem to be very surprised with that. But I always say it's that there's a reason why the word apartheid is a Dutch word. The what you see in South Africa, because the Dutch were the inventors of that racist system. You know what I mean?
Including the first, of course, apartheid wall, which was built downtown Manhattan at the time of Dutch colonialism, if you recall. Today it is known as Wall Street, but that's where the wall to protect the settlers had first been erected, right? But I should say that actually, I believe the Netherlands perhaps is the most hateful anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian country in Europe, and not only recently, but since World War II. I realize there are many rivals in Europe to acquire the status, but I do think the Netherlands is really and has always been in the forefront.
Oh, I'm very, very happy to speak to someone who is knowledgeable about this, who is not from the Netherlands. I'm pleasantly surprised, because I always say, in the Netherlands, we always think we're so tolerant and this and that. And I always say, no. The Netherlands is the front runner when it comes to Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism. It's such an incredibly racist society that is just convinced that it's not. It's really baffling. Yeah.
Because they do it with a smiling face.
Yeah.
They do it with a smiling face, and which is kind of connected to the commentary, the observations from Joseph, his experience coming to the U.S., his perception of the character of life in the U.S. Is quite normal for those of us who have an understanding of the history of this country. But what in that observation is also revealed is also the degree in which white supremacy was and is so completely normalized that for the ordinary person in the U.S., the privileges associated with whiteness, the narrative of how the U.S. evolved, including the extermination of the indigenous people, the attempts to reconcile with the African in the U.S. Toward a more perfect union that was is represented by the politics of the Obama administration much decades later, was all part of the narrative of development, a narrative of civilizational superiority with a little guilt because of the quote unquote errors that were made. So this process of normalizing white supremacy is something that's embedded in the consciousness and the culture of the United States of America. I would argue, however, that a challenge to that normalization has been taking place as a consequence of the events over the last 3 years. Again, if we look at the ordinary people, if you will, in the country, and I will include people in my family, primarily working class people and people who we struggle and organize with across the country. The the events of the last 3 years, beginning with the genocidal assault in Palestine, live streamed for the entire world, on the heels of the images of conflict that came out of Ukraine, that many people question the dominant narrative around the justifications for that war. We begin to see a bit of a shift in consciousness, if you will, one in which it became more difficult for the authorities, for the ruling elements, to be able to explain these events and to galvanize public opinion in support of military aggression, of genocide. In fact, to the extent that even at schools like where Joseph teaches, that the ruling class unleashed the authorities against their own children who had come out in opposition to not a quote unquote pro Palestinian position necessarily, but one that was anti genocide. And in those images of the authorities unleashing the full force of the state against their children, people who were opposed to genocide, began that shift, I think. And then with this latest episode of this unprovoked aggressive war against Iran, and the fact that this was something that was initiated by a administration that theoretically was supposed to be opposed to never-ending wars and all of this, who raised the issue of the interests of the globalists, we are starting to see a real crack, I think, a real fracturing, not only among MAGA elements, but among those liberal elements that traditionally have supported the neoliberal Democrats. And so I'm seeing a bit of a shift, and people are raising questions in public around issues of, in the character of Zionism, around the issues of white supremacy in ways that I haven't seen in quite some time, really since the 1960s and 1970s. So I'm seeing a shift that's being reflected also in the kinds of movement activities people also are either involved in or considering to involve themselves in.
And do you see that shift too, Joseph? Because I also notice a shift, but on the other hand, I also notice that often people still engage in that kind of innocence of the West and innocence of the United States in that shift and say, yeah, it's the Zionists and Israel that is controlling the United States, and therefore we need to decouple ourselves from Israel, and then everything will be fine, as if there wasn't any imperialist history before Israel and white supremacy. How do you see that, Joseph?
I believe, of course, that there has been a shift in terms of numbers, but the majority of those who have shifted, they have shifted to appreciate or support Palestinians as victims of genocide. which does not mean that they support the right of the Palestinians to resist genocide. This is not unlike white liberals in the United States who might have, in certain historical periods, supported African Americans or Latino Americans or Native Americans as victims of white racist violence, but not as having the right to actually resist that kind of violence. So I think there's a distinction to be made between the large majority of those who have shifted to no longer supporting Israel and to support Palestinians as victims, and a much smaller minority amongst those who might believe that the Palestinians also have a right to resist their persecutors and their oppressors. So that, I think, should always be kept in mind when speaking about shifts in public opinion or in the perhaps larger turnouts at demonstrations or in more recent polls about those who support the Israeli versus the Palestinian side. So I think, and this is not unlike sort of white liberals in South Africa. I mean, people like Steve Biko, who was, of course, murdered by the apartheid regime in the second half of the 1970s, knew very well how to address white liberal, so-called progressive voices who always supported the right or supported Black South Africans as victims of apartheid, but not the right to actually resist. Right. So it's very important to keep that in mind. I think this kind of pattern repeats itself across settler colonies, whether in the US, in New Zealand, if you will, with the Maori, Aboriginal peoples in Australia, in Canada, and certainly in South Africa. In Israel, the situation is a bit worse in the sense that whatever leftist Ashkenazi racists existed in the 70s and 80s that were not fully supportive of the settler colonial ventures in the West Bank and Gaza have retreated measurably since then. And as we've seen in polls, the vast majority of Israeli Jews supported the genocide and continue to support the Israeli war on Iran and object to its cessation, more according to recent Israeli polls. Now, the right wing and some left wing moves to try to blame Israel for US aggression are absolutely motivated by white supremacist anti Semitism. The idea, and this is, of course, hardly new. I mean, we see this idea about the Israel lobby becoming quite popular since the 1970s, especially with the rise of AIPAC to prominence as a very effective lobbying group in Washington, D.C. But of course, while of course I think the lobby is exceedingly important and the most powerful lobbying force in Washington, D.C. I do not believe it actually directs U.S. policy. Because, of course, what the argument seems to be saying is that absent the pro-Israel lobby and Israeli pressure, the U.S. would love Palestinians and Iranians and would not launch wars against them because the U.S. has been so magnanimous toward non-white people around the Third World since World War II. The fact that the United States, of course, has fought every single national liberation group, that has organized coups against any leader who dared to question American imperialism and who opted to have a welfare state for his population since World War II seems irrelevant, whether it's the removal of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, the removal of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, the removal of Sukarno in 1965 from Indonesia and the murder of more than 1 million people, the removal of Nkrumah in 1966 from Ghana, Israel's aiding the United States in neutralizing Nasser after 1967 in Egypt, the removal of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. All of that, of course, is part of the U.S. record. And to be quite honest, the Israel lobby had nothing to do with any of these. So it's unclear to me why the idea is the U.S. would act against every national liberation group in the Third World, but it would not have acted against the Palestinians had it not been for Israel. This is the logic of the Israel lobby folks. I think this is just absolutely unconvincing. Again, this is not to say that the Israel lobby is not exceedingly influential, especially on civil society, on the media, on universities, on cultural institutions. It is. It has targeted me for the last 25 years and has trumped up huge campaigns against me. So far, it has not succeeded in dislodging me from my tenured position at Columbia, or from the fact that I did get tenure despite their best attempts to prevent me from doing so. So I attest to their amazing and awesome power. I must say that I use the word awesome as an awe-instilling, because the media has mistaken me for a California surfer who uses the term awesome to mean, great or wonderful. But I thought, it merits mentioning here what the word awesome actually means for those in the media who remain illiterate. But nonetheless, so you see, so I also think that, and the idea that, for example, people like Tucker Carlson and others complain that the United States gives Israel an inordinate amount of money, which Israel does not deserve. Utterly untrue, of course. Israel has and continues to provide a huge amount of services to the United States, in addition to fighting wars on behalf of the United States, in which Jewish boys and girls get killed in Israel rather than American soldiers. It was very effective in defeating the PLO in 1982, a goal that the United States and Arab governments always sought. It was very effective in neutralizing Nasser in 67, which is why the US became its main sponsor and mother country after 67. So, in that sense, actually, American bases across the Middle East and the Arab world cost the US taxpayer a lot more than Israel does. So the idea that Israel is very costly is also not really persuasive. But people say, well, but if it is there to fight America's wars, why do we have to send our own army to also help? Well, in 2003, for example, when the US invaded Iraq, it could not send Israel, but it could not send also any of its troops from its local bases. They were not sufficient. So in that sense, Israel has always been a proxy of the United States. Now, of course, Israel has full autonomy as to what it can or cannot do to the Palestinians within its borders or the occupied territories, but it cannot do anything outside its borders without an American green light, if not American orders. And I also believe that the American business class and American billionaires, most of whom are Christian, some are Jewish, but they're the ones who actually push Israel to be more right-wing and to be more aggressive in its policies, rather than Israel pushing the United States and being more aggressive. So I am not on board with these ideas, even though some leftists, including Jewish members of Congress who've recently blamed Israel for quote unquote, dragging the United States into war with Iran. I do think Israel, of course, wants this war with Iran. I'm sure Israel has done its best to convince the United States.
This is not the end of the show. To see the full show, subscribe to our Substack. YouTube is squeezing the hell out of our channel, so we hope to slowly get away from YouTube. Come to our Substack to see the full show. Link is in the description.
Makes you feel no borders, no change, no silence.